Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. He was the man who saved New York. It was a time when Albany got things done, but when the days in wine and roses were over. He was a genial genius, war hero, odds defier. He was governor for hard winters, the Harry Truman of New York State. He's Hugh Carey, and he's the subject of a new and widely noticed and praised book by Seymour Lachman and Robert Polner. Seymour Lachman is the director of the Hugh L. Carey Institute for Government Reform at Wagner College and a distinguished professor there. He served as president of the New York City Board of Education and university dean at CUNY before being elected to 5 terms in the New York State Senate. Professor Lachman is the co-author of 2 books, One Nation Under God with Barry Cosman, and 3 Men in a Room, the inside story of power and betrayal in an American State House with Rob Polner. Robert Polner is a former award-winning reporter for Newsday, is public affairs officer for NYU and its Wagner School. He is editor of America's Mayor, America's President, The Strange Career of Rudy Giuliani, and co-author with Seymour Lachman of 3 Men in a Room, and he co-wrote New York Notorious, a borough-by-borough tour of the city's most infamous crime scenes. You got to read it. Welcome, both of you. Great book, great read. One review. The story how we averted the disaster in the fiscal crisis is grippingly told in a new biography of Governor Hugh Carey by Seymour Lachman and Robert Polner. The reviewer goes on to talk about the book's poignant relevance. The reviewer is Andrew Cuomo. Rob, you wrote a piece in October 10th's Newsday about the lessons of the fiscal crisis in Hugh Carey and the 51st governor. What are some of those lessons?
Well, one is that you don't have to necessarily be to honor the people who helped you get in. I mean, there was a certain amount of a maverick quality with Hugh Carey. And in fact, when he was elected in 1974, he ran without 4 of the 5 county bosses, Democratic bosses or county leaders, helping him. And so when he overcame the nominee, Howard Samuels, and won the primary and then won the election against Governor Rockefeller's handpicked replacement, who was then Governor Malcolm Wilson, he was in a unique position. He could hire people not based on patronage but based on merit, and he did. He surrounded himself. He was a secure and a very proud guy. He surrounded himself with highly talented staff who were really important when the city crisis hit. That's one lesson that the next governor should learn. The other is that you have to go up against entrenched interests sometimes, and Governor Carey was willing to do that.
Now, I would also add to that that Governor Cuomo, Governor-elect Cuomo, has an important job ahead of him. And when you mentioned him, I was surprised and thanked the governor's staff and the governor when he was running, that he had his Labor Day op-ed piece in the New York Daily News in which he laid out basically a formula for governance and what he's going to do. And he said he's going to do what Lachman and Polner have said Carey did.
Nice endorsement.
Yes, it was a fantastic endorsement.
I hope it's on your advertisements.
Oh,
come on.
Yes, it is. And his father said, Mario Cuomo, the following day, that Hugh Carey was one of the greatest governors in the 20th century in New York State. And he was correct.
Not only do you guys correctly suggest and point out in this really wonderful book that not only was he an exceptional character, but he's really underappreciated.
Yeah.
You know, this really significant achievement versus nobody really gets it and appreciates it. Why? Why is he so
Well, there are two
underappreciated?
reasons. Well, Rob will go into one. Another one is that when I called the New York State Archives, the head of the New York State Archives, the individual said to me, he said, "Thank goodness someone is now going to do a volume about Hugh Carey. We have a lot of books about Nelson Rockefeller and about Mario Cuomo, and yet the man who was sandwiched between them was able to take New York from the brink of bankruptcy and bring it back to solvency, and at the same time he was handed a plate by Nelson Rockefeller that he wasn't even told about during the campaign or even the interregnum before the election and the inauguration." So the people at the New York State Archives that I spoke to and the state librarian said, "Thank goodness that the two of you will be writing something about Hugh Carey." That was 3 years ago.
Why the attention now? I mean, the Times headline put it, "When Albany got things done." What is it about the story that seems to be I mean, you guys are all over. You're being interviewed, reviewed.
I think it's a story. It is a story about when Albany worked and made a progress in an effective way. It wasn't about grandiose reforms. It wasn't about tapping into the anger of the electorate, this was just after Watergate. There was a huge recession. Unemployment was double-digit. Inflation also was skyrocketing. So the public anger was there. But Carey didn't operate that way. He had served 7 terms in Washington. He was a good congressman with some significant legislation under his belt.
And a member of the House Ways and Means.
Very powerful
But
position.
when he ran in '74, I think there was a poll that showed only 5% of the voters of the state even knew who he was. Howard Samuels, who was an industrialist from Rochester, was a much better-known figure and heavily favored to win. In that idiosyncratic way, Hugh Carey said, "I can beat him." And he did, on his own, pretty much. Now,
His children would say, with the help
and
of
with the
the Carey children.
And Carey did talk a lot about the way. Remember, he was a father of 14 children.
Right, that's
from
a big
Brooklyn,
campaign
and he
staff.
had
And Nancy
a
Carey
ready
told me
campaign
the
staff.
only county he didn't carry was the county where the children didn't campaign in.
Well, come on.
They had to go back to school.
Okay, you mentioned Truman, and E.J. McMahon in a review of the book called Carey the Truman of New York State, just as Truman was, in a sense, unappreciated at his
The
time.
buck stops here.
Okay.
And now, Carey never blamed Rockefeller for anything, or Malcolm Wilson, who succeeded Rockefeller when Rockefeller became vice president. They must have known something. It could not all developed between November when he won and January 75 when he took office. He never, ever blamed any of his predecessors. He said, "This is my responsibility. I am the governor of New York State, and regardless of what they did, I have to repair it and change it." I want to go back, if I can, to what Rob just said, and the question in terms, your question, that the legislature worked. Now, I served in the state legislature for a decade, and it was very dysfunctional. Our previous book together in collaboration was 3 Men in a Room. I said to the Brennan Center people, it's not the most dysfunctional, state. I mean, there's the great state of Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi.
But this isn't good company.
No, I agree. But today, almost 4 years since we wrote 3 Men in a Room, it's even gone down further. I would say the state legislature today is the most dysfunctional.
Describe the nature of dysfunction. We always hear that it's dysfunctional. What is the nature of the dysfunction, and what's the cause of the dysfunction?
It involves. Well, Rob, do you want to go on, or should I? It involves the power structure in the state legislature. As a group, they don't have the class and the knowledge and the wherewithal of the legislators who served 25, 30 years ago.
You mean the individual legislators and the leadership?
And the leadership. And they do nothing without the leadership telling them what to do. In the decade that I was in the state Senate, no bill ever went through without the okay of Senator Joe Bruno, who was majority leader, and his deputy at that time, Dean Skelos, who was a very powerful man today, as we know. But no bill went through. There was no, I mean, the whole process, I mean, stunk. There was no process even. You couldn't debate certain things. You couldn't have amendments. The chairs of committees were not selected by the committee members. They were appointed by the leaders as perks for money. All you had to do while they put the glue on your seat and you is vote the way they wanted you to vote.
Now, Andrew Cuomo, in that op-ed piece in the Daily News that mentioned our book, signaled that he would not only ask for sacrifices from labor, as Carey did during the fiscal crisis, and labor was so critical to the rescue of New York City because the pension funds of labor bought the state special bonds that were backed by city revenue, the MAC bonds, to create revenue to keep New York City afloat when it didn't have money to pay its bills because the banks, the big banks, had just simply turned cold shoulder on the city and refused to lend it any more money. This was in the spring of '75, and that was the crisis, the second big crisis that Carey was met with, the first being within a few weeks of his office, something that Malcolm Wilson must have known about, I think, but never mentioned it to him, that the Urban Development Corporation was also sliding into default, which was a big blow to the state's credit worthiness. But getting back to that point, Cuomo signaled that he was he will not only ask a lot more of labor to help solve the state's intractable budget problems that are only getting worse and are going to cause huge trade-offs, but he would also work with the legislature. You had a figure in Carey's day in Warren Anderson, the Republican Senate Majority Leader from Binghamton, who recognized the centrality of the city as an engine of revenue for the entire state. Right. You don't see that kind of, I guess you'd call it, Seymour calls it class, but just an awareness, a political awareness, a political maturity that recognized it. Now Anderson made trade-offs. He wanted education money for upstate, and in return he would give the city approval to raise its taxes in Beamsday and so forth like that. He horse traded like any legislature.
You got it.
But you got it. But he also recognized the importance of the city and accepted the Carey administration's argument, which was very widely disbelieved, that if the city went down, the whole state was going to go down.
Now, I would go a step further and say that not only was it a legislative issue, and I spoke to Senator Anderson just before he died. He was a man in his 90s, when he told me that the legislators at that time, politics was important, majority control was important, but the survival of the state was also important. And Carey was believed. He was a figure, he was a governor who was believed, unlike the most recent governors, and respected. And what Carey asked, the lieutenant governor, the governor-elect has also asked in the op-ed piece that he wrote on Labor Day and in speeches afterwards, it's not just labor that has to give up a little bit. It's not just the working people, but business has to give up. The bankers have to give up. And Carey was able to convince them in his day that it was for the common good. And if they didn't do that, then they would all suffer.
Okay, so there are a couple of things that just came out of that. One is that not only is the legislature dysfunctional, but at least the last two governors have been themselves dysfunctional or non-functional, number one. And number two, the second thing I'm hearing is that there was more sense of public interest then, if you will, and it's much more naked, immediate self-interest now, or am I being naive here?
No, I think you're not being naive. I think that's true. I think there's also just a huge amount of business lobby influence in Albany that in 1975 had not yet ballooned, mushroomed to what it is today. Money played a role, but not as huge a role as it does today in Albany. As I think a kind of debasing, corrupting role when it comes to seek the interests of the estate as a whole. So a governor has to fight against those kind of currents in a way that maybe Carey didn't. He had a Chamber of Commerce. You know, he had bankers who lived or worked in the New York area who personified the interests of their banks. They weren't like computer cartels, you know, it's financial blinking on the screen.
One of the interesting things that you two bring up in the book is that the globalization of banking and finance removed those folks who either lived in New York City or lived in the suburbs and worked. They were New Yorkers.
They were New Yorkers.
Yeah.
They disliked unions. They thought government was corrupt. But they lived here, and they were arguing those points, I think, from the point of view that they were watching the civic fabric become more and more frayed in the 70s in this heavy recession. They were watching the spending of the city budget and the state budget continuing to rise in spite of it. So they were, in a way, justifiably upset, but they were ideologically conservative about government and labor. Carey had to found a way to work with him. An interesting thing about Hugh Carey, came from a business-oriented family. His father had sold petroleum that came in on
and his brother
tankers
Ed
during the
is
Depression
a
era.
very wealthy man in the oil
Right.
business.
And he wasn't a lifelong politician. He was a lawyer, he was a businessman, and when he entered politics, he entered on the national scene, as you said, a respected member of the House Ways and Means Committee, and he went across the aisle to establish relationships with someone like the minority leader, Gerald Ford, who later became president of the United States.
And we don't see that bipartisanship
No,
either
not
at the
at all.
state level nor at the national level.
There was a
totally,
cordiality.
it's totally different in that sense.
Okay. One question about the appreciation. Why was it so long delayed? Why did it take so long for the type of work that you guys wrote to actually be produced?
Okay. When he, first of all, in the first term, okay, he saves the city from bankruptcy. He takes a very recalcitrant Congress, and Ford the city dropped dead, which was not the exact words.
But at the end, Ford came through.
Right.
At the end, Ford
did
came
come
In
through.
part because of his real personal
But he had
relationships.
personal
relationships.
relationships. He knew his way around Washington. There are stories where he would walk into, these down the corridor this way, and his aides would go that way because he knew exactly, where the senators would be at that time of day, and they were going to the place where they were supposed to meet. He really knew his way around Washington, and he had friends there, and including Gerald Ford. So he brings home federal help, which were loans at a 1% interest rate
And which
above
we
the
pay off.
the Treasury's the basic rate. So the city pays it off and balances its budget over time. Now. But the second term is different. Now, in the second term, he fights with the legislature because having raised taxes as one of the measures and slashed the city budget through the Emergency Financial Control Board, he looks to essentially initiate a personal income tax rate cut, which he does do, the largest in the history of the state. But to do that, what he consistently did vis-a-vis the legislature was he underestimated the amount of revenues he expected would come in that coming budget year, and then he would
Classic
veto
problem.
the ads that the legislature,
So it
having
was
seen them go up,
contentious.
and there were about 160 overrides of his veto. There had maybe been one override in the past century, and 160 in a couple of years under Carey. So the relationship with the legislature really turned sour. At the same time, though, what I find impressive looking back, that's one reason he ends in dispute. But looking back, you have the personal income tax rate cut, and you have a slowing of Medicaid expenditure, which hasn't happened since. You have a whole series of you have a reduction, a new pension tier, which means that future employees'
Would not
retirement
get as much.
benefits, that's a savings of billions of dollars over the years in the future that Carey initiated.
But what about
But
his-
he
what-
ended very badly, and the press was all over
Yeah, but
him.
wait. But in addition, it was not only his relationship with the legislature; it was sort of his personal life.
His second marriage to a very glamorous woman.
News, good copy.
I mean, the press must have been very tired, had fiscal crisis fatigue at that point. Plus, People magazine was coming in for that kind of reporting. I sad to say, I guess, was coming into the force. So his personal life became grist for the press. So he has his new love. I can't remember how many ex-marriages she has,
Right,
or
didn't tell
whether
him.
they're alive or dead.
Right.
The spouses, when they turn up in the press, it's a great story. Hey, I'm alive. You had that story. You had Jimmy Breslin calling him Society Carey. You had this fight with the legislature. But
Does he
all this
lose-
stuff, really, come on.
Does
this
he
stuff
lose
doesn't matter.
interest in the job
No,
after having
let me
succeeded?
let me
Go
go
ahead.
on that point.
Go
I
ahead.
think that Hugh Carey's greatness,
Go ahead.
and I would say greatness, arose after his wife's death during the campaign. She was like the pillar of his life, and he would not have run for governor unless she gave him permission. And she said to him, "Look, if you win the governorship, we'll all be together in the executive mansion. If you lose the governorship, at least you will come home in the evening to see the children, and not like as a congressman go back
Sure.
and forth, etc." Carey, in my opinion, after this loss, needed challenges. And he received those challenges when he came into office and he saw the financial situation and the danger that New York City and New York State and many people, including Rob and I believe, would have a domino effect throughout the country. Carey's greatness rose with the challenges that he faced, the so-called impossible challenges to rectify. And he needed those to go to the top, and he went to the very top. Now, there is something in the second term, the major challenges were gone. And the second term, he had defeated his lieutenant governor in a primary, and he had defeated the chairman of the finance committee to gain a Democratic victory in the second primary for governor that people said he could never win. And then he went on to defeat Perry Duryea, former Speaker of the Assembly, who was way ahead in the polls. And it's comparable to what Rob said before. He defied the polls. He said this is not going to happen, and it didn't happen. So he was really fighting and doing things that other people could not, that he were in their position.
Okay.
And the second term was sort of a lull.
Okay.
And that created some problems as well.
To a certain extent, when I read this book, it's a case study of political leadership, and then both of you have touched on that. What is the essence? What are the elements of his leadership that particularly stand out?
I think he was a principled guy. For example, his position on the death penalty, which came out of his experiences in World War II.
He deliberated the Nordhausen concentration camp, right? His unit.
And he really stuck to his principles. And when he ran for second term against Duryea, who was pro-death penalty, he took a hit and his aides were telling him, "Are you crazy? You gotta moderate that, mitigate that." And he said, "No, I'm not going to do that." And that was a part. And I think a lot of people applauded him for his willingness to stand up for principle, even if they might have disagreed with his position.
Same thing with his successor, Mario Cuomo.
That's
you
right.
had a succession
Absolutely.
of 8 years of Carey and 12 years of Cuomo, where in the face of public outcries for
They
the death
opposed the death penalty.
And then
they vetoed
and
the
they
death
vetoed it.
I think he was willing to adapt to changing circumstances, which is important. He wasn't an ideologically rigid figure. He was a practical liberal. But he also was very strong-willed. When he figured out what he wanted to do, and sometimes it took a little time, he stuck with it, and he made it clear. He stood by his guns, and the government, the people he brought on, who were very excellent people, understood the direction the ship was going and worked. And he also made he raised the ante. He asked the entire state across sectors to work with him or maybe pay a price. And he stuck to his guns. He was a tough man.
One thing that I discovered in this, and Rob discovered as well, in all our interviews, and we had almost 50 interviews with different people, and we're fortunate that Carey's entire entourage were composed of the best and the brightest of the next generation, guys in their 20s and 30s. I mean, Dick Ravitch was 40, and he was one of the older ones there. And all of them, whether they were Peter Goldmark or a John Dyson or a Felix Rohatyn or Stephen Berger or a Dick Ravitch, I mean, we were amazed at a consistency of opinion, and almost a veneration of this man.
But you haven't
Julie
had,
Gribbets.
But you haven't had this in the last,
No,
with the
you
last
have not
several
had
executives.
this. You know why? Because I think, as Rob said, he stood with his principles. When he saw a problem, he didn't shirk his responsibilities. But at the same time, he gave it to his key deputies. And he said to them, this is the problem. This is how I want it to be resolved. This is the ball. You run with it. And I'm going to support you regardless of what the media and the public says until you reach the goal.
Okay, I've got a minute, but I've got 2 questions, and let's do it quick. Has Albany gotten so bad that it's really ripe for change?
Yes.
And number 2,
Yes.
Will 3 men in a room work? Is there the quality of leadership there that would allow a meeting of the legislative and executive
As
minds?
of now, no. 3 men in a room will still be a process, but it will not work as it did before. But it will be the process of the Assembly Speaker, the Majority Leader, and the Governor meeting on the budget, but
producing what?
And producing very, very little.
Oh, okay, we're going to stop right there. My thanks to Seymour Lachman and Rob Polner, co-authors of The Man Who Saved New York, Hugh Carey, and the Great Fiscal Crisis of 1975. See you next week. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.